Is an important matter, a matter that's been buried by the government, but Labor from the outset has been very clear about any allegations of misconduct by officers of registered organisations. We've been very clear that in relation to the Royal Commission established by this government, that we believe it should have been dealt with at the outset by the police and by the Australian Crime Commission. At the disposal of this government are agencies that have coercive powers and investigative powers that can, of course, deal with any serious allegation of crime. Now, what we've had today is the final report by the politically motivated witch hunt into the opponents of the government. What we've seen today, of course, is the culmination of $80 million of taxpayers' money being spent on a political witch hunt in order to attack the opponents of the government. And, of course, the test today for Malcolm Turnbull is to show whether, in fact, he runs the government or the government's still run by ideologues that he deposed. The test of Malcolm Turnbull today is to see whether, in fact, he will separate fact from fiction, whether he'll conclude as to how the government will approach based on evidence, not supposition. This Commission's report is full of supposition. The Commissioner himself has made very clear that he has relied on hearsay evidence and indeed that the Royal Commission is not a court of law. He makes it very clear in this report that these matters are not matters that are before a court, that the rules of evidence need not apply, and therefore any findings by this Commission must be understood in that context. And I want to remind people of the Commissioner and his role very recently, of course, in accepting an invitation to speak at a Liberal Party fundraiser. Mr Dyson Heydon, the man responsible to preside over this Royal Commission, accepted, while he was Commissioner, an invitation to speak at a Liberal Party fundraiser so money could be raised for the political party of the government. Mr Dyson Heydon was found to be accepting that invitation, and only once it was publicly disclosed did Mr Dyson Heydon choose not to proceed and to speak at that fundraiser. We argued at the time that there was a clear, apparent conflict of interest of Mr Dyson Heydon, given his association with the Liberal Party and his keen willingness to accept an invitation to speak at the Liberal Party fundraiser. We therefore concluded that Mr Dyson Heydon was not qualified, indeed not capable of fairly dispensing with his responsibilities as Commissioner of a very politically charged Royal Commission. Now, you might recall we called upon the then Prime Minister Tony Abbott to stand down Mr Dyson Heydon, and he chose not to do so. The matter, of course, then went to Dyson Heydon, and Dyson Heydon chose not to stand down, chose, therefore, to judge himself free from any bias whatsoever. I'd like to refer you to the actual comments of Mr Dyson Heydon when he was a High Court judge, when he said, any appearance of a departure from neutrality would warrant a person standing aside. And yet he did not heed his own words. Mr Dyson Heydon did not listen to his own words when he chose to continue to preside over this politically charged commission, and therefore this commission must also be seen in the context of the person who was leading the processes and procedures of the commission. I want to make it very, very clear. Labor will not ever condone misconduct, criminal misconduct or violent behaviour of anyone, officers of a union, officers of an employer body, indeed employers. We would never condone such conduct, and we've been, from the beginning, upfront with the Australian people to say any allegations of such conduct should be referred to the police and or the Crime Commission. So that's our view, and that's been our view from the very outset. We've always been clear that we wanted to ensure that there are good governance arrangements for registered organisations, and that's why some weeks ago the Labor leader, Bill Shorten, and I announced reforms that we believe will improve the governance of unions and employer bodies, including having ASIC as the body that would investigate serious contraventions by officers of those organisations, improving auditor penalties so that people who did not disclose or report such matters could be subject to greater penalties, improving whistleblower protections afforded to whistleblowers in the private sector but also in the registered organisations to which we refer. We also looked at increasing penalties, and indeed we've also added some extra proposals for the government to consider. Because if the government wants to deal with this problem, rather than play politics, it will sit down with the opposition to consider these matters as it should. But I'll make it very clear. We believe this has been a political exercise from the start. We've seen 3 Labor leaders summons to royal commissions of this government in less than 2 years, none of whom have actually been subject to findings by either of the 2 commissions that this government has established. And yet, of course, we know the reason why the government has chosen to summons 3 Labor leaders, no less than 2 Prime Ministers of this nation, to royal commissions. As I said from the outset, we will look closely at the findings of this commission, but it's important to understand its history and understand the history of the Commissioner and understand the basis upon which these findings are made. And I think it's very important for Malcolm Turnbull to decide who's running the government. Is Tony Abbott running the government? Are the right-wing ideologues still running the government? Or indeed, does Malcolm Turnbull run the government? Is it the case that Malcolm Turnbull will follow Tony Abbott the way in which he's followed him on climate change or marriage equality, or indeed will he take a separate path? I guess we'll find that out today, because I think it's incumbent on the Prime Minister to make very clear how he's going to deal with such matters. Can I also say that in relation to the comments that these matters are widespread, I want to refer to the comments by the Commissioner in this report. And he says, and I quote, and he's also referring to a comment made by the council assisting the Commission, "The problem is not with union members, it's not with unions themselves, which play an important part in the industrial relations system and have done so for a long time. It's a problem with some union officials." So if that is the case, and that's what the Commissioner is suggesting and concluding, then it cannot be described as widespread systemic corruption in any way. And I think, therefore, the government must fully consider those matters as well. Can I just say, finally, in relation to the timing of this report, it's quite remarkable that the government has chosen between Christmas and New Year not only to sack 2 ministers, not only to cut education funding and reduce Gonski reforms as promised before the election, but indeed to hand down this report in this manner at a time when people, of course, are able to spend time with friends and family. It is an unusual time for it to happen. We would argue it should have been done in at a time when people are paying more attention to such matters of public interest. And I'd also point out that last week, when the Productivity Commission report was handed down and recommended cutting penalty rates for retail workers and hospitality workers, Malcolm Turnbull could not be found. Malcolm Turnbull was nowhere to be seen when that report was handed down, and yet today I understand he wants to comment on this report. Well, he may also choose, and I think he should choose, to explain the government's position in relation to penalty rates and other conditions of employment of workers, because in the end, Labor wants to make sure that the government does not use this report to attack working people and attack working conditions. I'm very happy to take questions.